Welcome to today's deep dive. And we are tackling a pretty contentious question. Are the Kukis invaders in Northeast India? We're going to be going beyond just the headlines to try and get to the bottom of this and really explore this complex issue from a historical perspective.
Yeah, it's a really important question and one that I think is often surrounded by, honestly, a lot of assumptions and even misinformation.
Yeah.
So I think it's really great that we're going to dig into this today.
Yeah. So to get started, maybe let's just back up a little bit and kind of lay the groundwork. Who exactly are the Kukis? I mean, I know they're an indigenous group in Northeast India, but like, how do they fit into the larger ethnic landscape?
So Kuki itself is actually a term that comes from outside the group. It's more of a blanket term. And the people themselves actually identify with more specific subtribes like the Fadu or the Hmar or the Pate. And
Ah.
each of these has its own distinct cultural practices and traditions and histories. But what links them all together is this shared linguistic heritage. They belong to the Tibeto-Burman family, and they've been present in the region going back centuries.
Okay, so not a monolithic group then, but more like an umbrella term encompassing these different communities who share common roots.
Exactly.
Okay,
Yeah.
that makes sense. Now, I know a lot of the debate around the Kukis stems from this idea that they migrated from somewhere else. Like that's kind of the basis of the whole invader narrative.
Yeah.
What does the historical record actually tell us about their migrations?
Yeah, so it's true that the Kukis, just like a lot of other groups in Northeast India, they do have a history of migration. They are believed to have originated in the Chin Hills of Myanmar, and then over time they kind of gradually moved into different parts of what is now Northeast India. And we're talking as early as like the 16th century even,
Mm.
before British colonization.
Wow, even before British colonization.
Yeah.
That's really interesting. So it seems like this whole invader label is maybe a little too simplistic then, huh?
Yeah, I mean, to just label them as invaders, just
Yeah.
because they migrated, ignores the fact that migration itself is kind of a defining feature of Northeast India's history.
Hmm.
I mean, this is a region where ethnic groups have been interacting and intermingling and moving across what are now modern-day borders for generations.
Hmm.
It's much more fluid and complex than these simple narratives sometimes suggest.
Right. It's not like they just suddenly appeared and took over. So if that's the case, why does this whole invader narrative persist? What are some of the things feeding into this perception, you think?
Well, one thing we can't ignore is the legacy of British colonialism.
Hmm.
The British, as they were trying to control and administer the region, they often implemented policies that actually made existing tensions between different groups, including the Kukis, worse.
Yeah.
They did things like resettlement, and they created these designated hill tracts, which were meant for administrative purposes, but they sometimes disrupted traditional land use patterns and created competition for resources.
Ah, so it sounds like the British, even though they didn't intend to, might have actually fueled some of these conflicts that we see today.
Yeah, absolutely. Their interventions definitely had unintended consequences.
That makes a lot of sense. What about the conflicts themselves? Like, I know there have been clashes, especially between the Kukis and the Nagas. How have those events kind of played into this whole narrative?
Yeah, the Naga-Kuki clashes in the 1990s were a really tragic chapter, marked by a lot of violence and displacement. And it's true that some Naga groups do say that the Kukis encroached on their ancestral lands, particularly during and after the colonial period. So these competing claims over land and resources, they definitely added fuel to the fire. And in some circles, that's when the Kukis really started to get labeled as these invaders.
So it sounds like there's a lot of historical baggage and these unresolved land disputes that are really at the heart of a lot of
Yeah.
this. But earlier you mentioned that the Kukis also have this history of resistance to British rule. Like they weren't just passive bystanders in all of this. Can you tell me a little more about that?
Oh yeah, absolutely. The Kukis were not at all just passive subjects of the British. In fact, they resisted British authority pretty actively on several different occasions. And one of the prime examples is the Kuki Rebellion of 1917-1919.
Oh,
That uprising, it was sparked by the British trying to impose forced labor and other really oppressive policies on the Kukis. And this really demonstrates how deeply rooted they were in the region and how willing they were to fight for their autonomy. They weren't newcomers just trying to take over something. They were a community defending their way of life.
so it's kind of a turning point in a way, huh? Or at least a moment that shows just how strong their connection to the region really was. I mean, they're pushing back against these colonial powers, they're defending their land, and they're asserting their identity. It's a powerful story that, like you said, kind of gets overshadowed by this whole invader narrative.
Yeah, exactly. And it's so important to remember that because when people throw around that label of invader, they're often ignoring this long history of resistance and that deep connection that the Kukis have to this land.
Right. Okay, so we're starting to see a much more complicated picture emerge here. The Kutukis, they're not these simple outsiders or invaders. They've got a long and interwoven history with the region, one that's marked by both migration and resistance and cultural exchange and conflict. But even with this more nuanced view, how do we square that with the fact that some people still see them through that very simplistic lens?
Well, that's where things get even more interesting, and that's kind of
Mhm.
what we're going to look at next. How do these competing historical narratives end up shaping our understanding of identity and belonging in a place as diverse as Northeast India?
We've been talking about this invader label and how it doesn't really fit when you consider all the complexities of Kuki history in Northeast India.
Yeah.
And it seems like to really understand this, we have to dig a little deeper, challenge some of these assumptions that are out there.
I think that's exactly right. And to do that, I think it can be really helpful to actually zoom in on the history of interactions between different groups in the region. So, for example, if we look at the relationship between the Kukis and the Nagas, a lot of the focus, especially now, is on the conflicts between those groups, especially the violence we saw in the
Yeah.
1990s. But I think if we only look at that, if that's all we focus on, we miss a really important part of the story.
Oh, okay. So there's more to it than just conflict. What else should we be paying attention to?
Well, what's really fascinating is that before things escalated in the 1990s to that level of violence, there's actually a long history of interaction between Kuki and Naga communities. And it wasn't always hostile. Like you find accounts of intermarriage between the groups, they shared certain cultural practices, and there were even times when they formed alliances, against external threats.
Really? That's not usually the picture that gets painted when you hear about these groups. It sounds like there was a level of coexistence that we don't often talk about.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what I mean about these complexities, right? They're often kind of brushed aside in favor of a narrative that's much more simplistic. And I think, honestly, more divisive, too.
Right.
It's easier to make sense of conflict if you just see it in black and white terms, good guys versus bad guys.
Yeah.
But as with most things, the reality is much more nuanced.
Right. So it's not so simple as one group just coming in and taking over another's territory. There's this whole background of relationships, good and bad, that needs to be considered too.
Exactly.
Okay.
And that interconnectedness, it's not limited to just the Kukis and the Nagas. I mean, if we kind of zoom out a bit and look at the broader context of Northeast India, you see this really amazing tapestry of cultural exchange and shared histories and these multiple migrations that have all kind of been woven together over centuries.
Yeah, it's like we've been looking at a single thread in a huge tapestry and not appreciating the whole picture.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that analogy. That's perfect. And I think, unfortunately, that kind of narrow focus on certain historical events, while we ignore others, it can have real-world consequences, because it perpetuates stereotypes, it deepens these divisions, and ultimately it makes it much harder to build bridges between communities.
And it also makes it harder to understand the present, I think. If we're just clinging to these oversimplified versions of the past, then we're missing out on actually learning from history and then hopefully using that to build a better future.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And that's why it's so important to really challenge these narratives, to embrace a more inclusive and nuanced understanding of history, one that actually recognizes the agency and resilience of all the different communities involved.
Okay, so how do we actually do that? How do we move beyond these really simplistic and often kind of harmful labels and actually start building those bridges you talked about?
Well, I think education is a huge part of it.
Yeah.
We need to make sure that our history textbooks, the curricula that we're teaching kids in school, that they actually reflect these complexities. We have to move beyond those black and white narratives and offer a more balanced view of the past.
Right. Education, if it's done well, I mean, that can be such a powerful tool for dismantling these stereotypes and encouraging empathy. But what about beyond the classroom? How do we start to address these issues in like a broader societal context?
Well, I think it really begins with dialogue, open, honest, and respectful dialogue between different communities.
Mm.
We need to actually create spaces where people feel safe to share their own perspectives, to actually voice their grievances, and to really work towards understanding.
And that dialogue needs to be based on mutual respect,
Mhm.
right? Not just kind of talking at each other, but actually listening and trying to understand where the other person's coming from.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's not about one side winning or losing an argument.
Yeah.
It's about finding common ground.
Yeah.
And I think it's also about being willing to challenge our own biases and assumptions. We all come to the table with our own baggage. Our upbringing, the stories we've been told, the media we consume, all of that shapes our worldview.
Yeah.
And so being self-aware of those biases, I think, is really crucial for having these kinds of meaningful conversations.
Yeah. And it's not just about individuals, right? I mean, institutions and systems have a role to play in perpetuating these harmful narratives, too.
Oh, absolutely. We need to look at how our political systems, our legal frameworks, even our media, how they all contribute to the marginalization of certain groups. It's about recognizing those systemic factors that are really underpinning a lot of these issues and working to create a society that's more just and equitable.
So it's really this multifaceted approach. It's not just one thing. We have to be addressing this from all these angles. Education, dialogue, systemic change. It's not going to be easy, but I mean, it's something that has to happen, right?
Yeah, you're right. It's not going to be easy. There are some really deep-seated biases and these historical wounds that need to be acknowledged and really, truly addressed. But I think recognizing that shared humanity and that interconnectedness of all these communities, that's really essential if we're ever going to build a better future.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about challenging these narratives and promoting dialogue, but what about some alternative frameworks for understanding the Kukis' place in Northeast India? Like if we're moving away from this invader label, what are some other lenses that we can use to view their history and their identity?
That's a great question. I think there are a couple of really promising avenues that we can explore. One is to look at the Kukis through this lens of indigeneity.
Indigeneity. Can you say a bit more about what you mean by that?
Yeah, sure. So the Kukis, like many other tribal groups in the region, they have this very deep and ancestral connection to the land. They have their own unique customs and traditions and ways of life that have been passed down for generations. And so recognizing their indigeneity means respecting their right to self-determination, respecting their cultural heritage, and their role as stewards of their ancestral lands.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's about acknowledging those deep roots in the region, their right to define their own identity on their own terms.
Yeah, exactly.
Are there any other frameworks you think might be helpful here?
Another really interesting way to approach this is to actually see the Kukis as part of this larger narrative of Northeast India's shared history. As we've been talking about, migration and cultural exchange have really shaped this region for centuries. And the Kukis, with their own unique history and traditions, are a really integral part of that whole intricate tapestry.
So instead of seeing them as outsiders or invaders, we should be recognizing them as active participants in this ongoing story of Northeast India.
Exactly. And I think that recognizing that shared history, both the positive and the negative aspects, that can be a really powerful force for building bridges and fostering a real sense of unity.
Right. Okay, so we've got these ideas of looking at the Kukis through these lenses of indigeneity and shared history
Yeah.
and recognizing their agency in shaping the region. These are all really important shifts in perspective, but how do those ideas actually translate into concrete actions? Like, how do we move from theory to practice here?
Well, I think one crucial step is making sure that Kuki voices are heard and that their perspectives are represented in every aspect of society. That means creating spaces where Kuki scholars and historians and artists and community leaders where they can share their knowledge and their experiences.
That's such a good point. It's not enough to just talk about inclusion. We have to actually create platforms for those voices to be amplified and for their contributions to be recognized.
Exactly. And that also means supporting Kuki-led initiatives that are focused on cultural preservation and economic development and social justice. It's about empowering those communities to shape their own destinies and to contribute their own unique perspectives to the larger conversation.
Right. So it's about moving beyond just representation to actual empowerment, making sure that they have a seat at the table and a real voice in shaping their own future.
Exactly. And I think that empowerment, it starts with recognizing their inherent rights, recognizing their historical contributions, and their ongoing role in shaping the vibrant tapestry of Northeast India.
This has been such an insightful conversation. We've really unpacked a lot of complex issues here, challenged that invader narrative, and explored some really interesting alternative frameworks for understanding Kuki identity and their place in the region. But I feel like there's still so much more to discuss.
Oh, there definitely is. But that's kind of the beauty of history, right? There's always more to learn, more perspectives to consider, and those deeper connections to uncover.
Well, on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this part of our deep dive. But don't worry, we're not done yet. In the final part, we're going to delve into some of the specific challenges and also the opportunities that lie ahead as we work toward a more inclusive and equitable future for all the communities in Northeast India. So stay tuned. We'll be right back after a short break. Welcome back to our deep dive. We've been talking about this whole idea of the Kukis as invaders in Northeast India
Right.
and really challenging that label, was exploring the nuances of their history, their relationships with other groups, and their connection to the region.
Yeah, and I think what we're seeing is that invader narrative, it really doesn't hold up when you look at the bigger picture. It just oversimplifies things, you
Yeah.
know? And it leads to these harmful stereotypes that really damage efforts to build understanding between communities.
Right. It ignores all those nuances we've been talking about. Migration, cultural exchange, shared histories, all these things that have been shaping Northeast India for centuries. And it's not just an academic debate either. I mean, this label has very real consequences. It contributes to discrimination and sometimes even
Oh,
violence.
absolutely. It's a very loaded term, and it gets used in really damaging ways.
So it's clear we need to move past that label. We've got to find different ways of understanding the Kukis and their place in the region.
Right.
And we've talked about some alternative frameworks, haven't we? Like viewing them through this lens of indigeneity,
Yeah.
recognizing their long history, acknowledging that they've played an active role in shaping the cultural landscape of Northeast India.
Exactly. It's about seeing them as a community with deep roots and a rich heritage, a community that has a right to define its own identity.
Okay, so we've got these different perspectives. But even then, even when we shift our thinking, there are still some very real challenges on the ground, aren't there? I mean, we've talked about things like these land disputes, historical grievances, tensions between different groups. These things don't just disappear overnight.
No, they don't. And they're really complicated issues.
Yeah.
There are no easy solutions. And often they come from a lot of different factors, all mixed together. Historical injustices, competition for resources, even political manipulation, and of course the persistence of those same harmful stereotypes that we've been talking about.
So, where do we go from here? How do we start to address these challenges and actually work towards a future that's more just and equitable for everyone in Northeast India?
Well, I think it starts with really acknowledging just how interconnected all these issues are. You can't address land disputes, for example, without dealing with the historical grievances that are often tied up in those disputes, right?
Right.
And you can't ignore the systemic factors, things like poverty and inequality and marginalization. We've got to recognize that all these challenges are kind of woven together, and we need solutions that take that into account, a more holistic approach.
So we're not talking about quick fixes, but more like really deep, long-term systemic change.
Exactly. And I think that kind of change, it has to start with making sure that every community has a voice in shaping the policies that affect their lives. So that means creating spaces for real dialogue. Spaces for negotiation, for collaboration. It means empowering those communities that have been marginalized to actually participate in the decision-making processes, to advocate for their needs and interests.
It's about more than just token representation then. It's about actually giving them the power to shape their own future.
Exactly. And that empowerment can take a lot of different forms. It can mean supporting community-led initiatives, things like cultural preservation programs, economic development projects, efforts to promote social justice. It's about giving communities the tools and resources they need to thrive.
So really what we're talking about is a pretty fundamental shift in how things work, moving away from these top-down approaches to something that's more collaborative, something that's built on real participation.
Right. And that kind of shift, it requires everyone to be willing to challenge those existing power structures, to look at how resources are distributed and ask, is this fair? Is this equitable? It also means confronting historical injustices and figuring out how to repair the damage that's been done by colonialism and discrimination.
So it's not enough to just say, oh, yeah, we made mistakes in the past. We have to actually do something about it. We have to take concrete steps to address the legacy of those mistakes.
Exactly. That could mean things like land reform, reparations for the harms that were committed, investing in education and economic opportunities for those communities that have been left behind.
It's a long road ahead, isn't it?
It is. It's going to be long, and it's going to be complicated. But it's absolutely necessary if we want to build a better future for Northeast India, a future that's more peaceful, more just, and more equitable for everyone.
And it's going to take all of us working together to make that happen. Governments, civil society organizations, community leaders, individuals, we all have a role to play in this. We have to challenge those harmful narratives, we have to promote dialogue, and we have to commit to working together towards that shared vision, a vision of a future where every community can thrive.
I completely agree.
Well, this has been a really eye-opening deep dive, I think. We've unpacked a lot of really complicated issues, debunked some harmful stereotypes, and explored some different ways of thinking about the Kukis and their place in Northeast India. We've talked about the challenges, but also the opportunities.
Yeah.
And I think at the end of the day, what this all comes down to is empathy. It's about listening to each other, really trying to understand different perspectives. It's about being willing to question our own assumptions and recognizing that we're all connected in some way.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to put it.
So I want to thank you, first of all, for taking this journey with us, for joining us on this deep dive. And I hope for all of our listeners that this has encouraged you to think a little more critically about the stories you hear, about the narratives that are out there, and to approach these complex issues with nuance and a real commitment to understanding.
Yeah, and we hope it inspires you to keep learning, to engage with people who might have different viewpoints than your own, and to work towards that more inclusive and equitable future for everyone.
Thank you so much for listening. And until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep the conversation going.